I can? Okay. Yes. Good afternoon for everyone. I'm very pleased to say hello to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. And also, I'm very pleased to say that this afternoon, as a continuation of the discussion of this morning, we will talk about the revisionist power. The title of this session is the world witnessing a revisionist moment? And for this discussion, I'm very pleased to introduce our three extraordinary panelists. I will start for my right side and say that here is Sergei Utkin. Actually, currently, he's professor in Copenhagen. Please. Odense University in Denmark. And I met Sergei like 5-6 years ago. I don't remember very well. We are together members of the European Leadership Network. And he's an expert not only in Russia, of course, but also in many issues of the international politics. On my left side, first I would like to introduce Mustafa Ayan. He is also a professor of the international relations and a lot of things. I met him like 3 months ago in Istanbul, and he impressed me with his speech about the foreign policy of Erdogan and current Turkey, and that happened after the presidential elections in Turkey. So I think that Mustafa can tell us a lot of very interesting and very important things in this sense about current situation in Turkey and about foreign policy of Erdogan. Finally, but not, I mean, it's just finally, Ivan Vejvoda, my old friend from Belgrade, and also maybe a kind of not old panelist, but it's not first time for Ivan Vejvoda to collaborate with FAES Foundation, and last year he participated in campus FAES, and he has been talking about the EU enlargement. Today he will talk about this topic of revisionist powers, and I will organize this roundtable in the way that I choose this topic like a continuation of the discussion on Ukraine, because it's obvious that Ukrainian war is a kind of symptom of the process of re-imperialization of Russia, but also of what Jeff Mankoff, United States political analyst, called like Euro-Asianist imperial moment, in sense that Mankoff said that we are a witness of the international context where the end of the 20th century and these first 23 years of the 21st century has marked by increasing power of the revisionist powers. Now, after the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson said that he spoke of the need to make the world safe for democracy. And since his administration, I think that all presidents of the United States and the European Union, the West, what we call West, try to make a world safe for democracies. Now, in the 21st century, we are witness of this increasing power of the revisionist powers, and many analysts said that countries like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey would like to make a world order where the revisionist power will be comfortable. A world order which will be comfortable for autocracies. So I will start with my first question for Sergei, and of course we have to talk about Russia. In 1994, in his book Diplomacy, in 1994, I would like to highlight this year, Henry Kissinger said that we still don't know in 1994, but that is very possible and maybe probable that given the experience in European foreign policy with Russia, that Russia just will not accept it, the world order created after the end of the Cold War, and the most probably is that Russia will start with the new process of re-imperialization. Now, and he said it in 1994. This morning, many people mentioned the famous speech of Vladimir Putin in the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when Putin said that Russia does not recognize the international order created after the Second World War and the end of the Cold War. And then we had Georgia War in 2008 and different very conflict and tense situation between the United States and Russia. And maybe culmination of it is the war in Donbass and annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the last invasion of Crimea by Russia in 2022. So, Sergei, my question for you is Russia in this process of re-imperialization, or maybe Russia is in what another analyst called security dilemma, and this reaction of Russia is just reflects its rejection of the NATO enlargement, of the as many Russian analysts, as Dmitry Trenin, for example, called that Russia just would like to reject United States hegemony in the world. So, put us on the map of the Russian thinking. I know that you are very critical with Russian current foreign policy. So, help us to understand better it, please. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mira. I'd say, you used several terms, almost like synonymous, but I think they are a little bit different. You spoke about revisionism, you spoke about new imperialism, and we can add to that probably revanchism. And if it comes to revisionism, I think the question whether we see Russia making a kind of revisionist attempt is almost rhetorical. So even if you justify Russian actions on the basis of security dilemma and true security concerns, in the end of the day, it is a revision of what has been the world order as we knew it in the last decades. And what is important from the angle of Russian political elite, I think they make a very significant distinction between the world order created at the end of the Second World War and the world order that emerged from the Cold War. So the end of the Second World War is the victorious Soviet Union that managed to secure positions in Europe and beyond that it rather wanted to keep. So at that point, it acted as status quo power, which was basically the reason why, in spite of all the controversies between the Soviet Union on the one hand and capitalist states on the other, we could create some kind of system during the Cold War where people respected, at least to an extent, positions of each other. Everybody accepted a certain set of rules, although, you know, I'm not the one who will say that the Cold War was such a nice and predictable environment. Some people say it, I think they just ignore the risks that we were passing through in the years of the Cold War. They just know that things ended relatively smoothly in the end of the Cold War, and this is why they are saying that in the Cold War it was kind of less risky than what we have now. I think there were significant risks back then. But one thing that you kind of didn't mention in terms of explanations, yes, there's an explanation of revisionism, neo-imperialism, there's an explanation of security dilemma, but many people are looking today at domestic roots of this significant hardening of Russian foreign policy that created an almost unsurmountable rift between Russia and the West. Many are pointing at the fact that, well, when you feel like your political system is so much different from Western standards, and you do not want to transform it according to the Western standards, but you want to keep it as it is. So basically, if you speak in concrete terms, you have the ruling group that is ruling Russia for like a quarter of a century, and if they feel they want to keep these positions, they might feel the need to perpetualize, you know, the impulse towards the society to rally around the flag, to support the government, to electrify them with a certain task. And these goals of a revenge, the goals that one can call neo-imperialists, they become this kind of impulse, maybe. So this is another interpretation which is quite widespread among critical voices in Russia, critical towards Putin and the Russian government. And in this sense, I'd say, you know, it's you probably always have in a society different people with different approaches, different ideas. You always have in every country, even the most educated and advanced, people who just believe in conspiracy theories, people who believe that the world is run by extraterrestrials. You have all sorts of people. And the question is not that much what kind of views you have in principle among some members of the society, but where the mainstream runs. And I can recall neo-imperialist notes in Russian political discussion from the point of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they are not new, but they were not the mainstream. And this is, I think, important to understand that you probably cannot completely get rid of neo-imperialist attitudes given the country's history, but you can have them influence the actual policies to different degrees. In the 1990s, the influential mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, he was very supportive of this idea of Russian Crimea, and he didn't hide it, he sort of popularized it, but it remained his own political game. It didn't come to the level of the country, and on the contrary, President Yeltsin at the time, he, with all his deficiencies, decided that it's important to fix the issue of borders with Ukraine in a way so that nobody raises the Crimea again. So this didn't really help in the longer run, but back then you had the mainstream running in a different direction. And I think it was a responsibility of politicians not to make use of neo-imperialist feelings because they are super dangerous. At some points, you even could interpret Putin's own words as sort of understanding of the fact that this is dangerous, but that was in early 2000s. He had his own personal evolution, he had an evolution of his goals, and he decided to capitalize on these feelings. So this is what we are passing through. Of course, he interprets this as just defending Russia's interests and doing what's necessary, and the official line is that Russia had no other choice, but I cannot buy it. It's, you always have a choice. If the choice that you make is so disastrous, then it is your responsibility, and you face all the consequences that Russia is facing along with Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is the one that suffers the most, but for Russia it's also not easy. And the last thing that I wanted to add to that, when we speak of neo-imperialism, when we add this neo to imperialism, what is the standard of imperialism that we think about? I think it's not even the Soviet Union that people of Putin's generation probably still relate themselves to. They gave oath to the Soviet Union back in the day. They served the state of the Soviet Union, so they definitely relate to it. But when it comes to imperialism, most people have an idea of 19th century Russian Empire, but then one thing that somehow slips away from the mind of most people is how much the world has changed since 19th century. So we do not, we do not live anymore in a world which is less than 2 billion people overall. Which is mostly agrarian societies, where you have like 80+% of the population, not just peasants, but in Russia's case, serfs in a position of serfdom. You had incredible levels of illiteracy, and this is what facilitated the spread of the empire, because if the empire came to some new areas, they could just impose on people who had no real ability to resist what they thought was necessary. And is it still the case in today's world? How much can you even attempt to impose any external rule on people who want to have it different, who are all graduated from at least high school, and very often they hold the idea of their nationhood very dear to them? How can you change it? Are there cases when you can change it? At least, definitely, it's not at the level of 19th century that you can even attempt that. And I think this is what you can see in case of Russia's policies to Central Asia. Of course, Russia wants to spread influence to Central Asia, but does it want to have Central Asian republics, former republics of the Soviet Union, back in the Russian state? Not really. It is aware that it's a number of Muslim population that it will not be able to control in the ways that it would love to. So the case of Ukraine and maybe Belarus is kind of unique because what's new about this imperialism is that in the eyes of the Russian government, they are not just spreading their rule somewhere abroad, but they are playing with the identity issue. They believe Ukraine, Belarus are kind of countries where you can remind people who are basically speaking Russian language as their own that the fact that they lived for last 30 years in their sovereign state is a joke of history. That in the longer run, it may well be that they will just contribute to this greater Russia development and everybody will just benefit from that. So this is the ambition. But if you ask me, I think this ambition is leading us to further catastrophes rather than greatness.
Thank you, Sergei. I just want to say that I use the concept of the international world order after the Second World War and Cold War in the sense that after the Cold War, at least the West has been thinking that there is a kind of universalization of the world order which was created by the West after the Second World War, and finally with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that all East European countries and even Russia, it looks like in 1990s that Russia with Yeltsin maybe will be part of this world order which started to be created by the West after the Second World War with the Atlantic Charter and so on. So in this sense, I use this, I link these two concepts, but I completely agree that one thing is the Soviet Union, the second superpower of the world during the Cold War, and Russia, which even has a kind of ambition to be superpower, definitely is not, of course, the Soviet Union. So, but Mustafa, when I met Mustafa, I think that he was one of the most honest Turkish analysts who really has been talking very openly about the Turkish foreign policy and above all about Erdogan's ability to make like a Turkish foreign policy, and above all to put Turkey on this new great power competition and to looking for one role for Turkey which will be I think follow the thinking of Erdogan, if I may say in this way, is just to achieve the place for Turkey which Erdogan think that Turkey deserved. So Turkey does not annexated any territory, but we have seen in Syria, for example, how Turkey would like to conserve its zones of influence. We see it in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We see it in his support of Azerbaijan, of the Tatars of Crimea, so on. It's not re-imperialization in sense of Russian foreign policy, definitely. Maybe it is not revisionism, because Turkey is a member state of NATO, at least. But what is it? It's a new sultan. We have a Tsar. And what is Erdogan? So Welcome to FAES.
Thank you, Mira. Difficult questions. When I'm asked about talking about Turkey or President Erdogan, I always ask a question first. Which Turkey, which Erdogan? He came to power in 2002 and have successfully won several elections. And every time, actually, he won an election, he changed his allies. And with his allies, he also changed his policies, both inside Turkey and outside Turkey. And Turkish foreign policy, in his time, since 2002, has been adapting and changing at least 4 times that I can count. But even before Erdogan came to power, Turkey was changing. Its traditional foreign policy and security policy was grounded in NATO and in Western alignment system during the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War forced Turkey to rethink its position in the world and its position in its neighborhood. There were many challenges that Turkey faced at the end of the Cold War. It eventually forced Turkey to adapt and reimagine itself. Because remember, at the end of the Cold War, I always, when I start talking about Turkish foreign and security policies, I start with a map. Although we don't have a map here, but I put all the wars and the conflicts in the vicinity of Turkey, in 2 hours of flying time from Ankara, since 1991. And it's an incredible map. No other country in the West and no other country in Europe have faced that kind of a map since 1991. And in fact, in 1991, when European countries, most of our allies, not only the European countries, but NATO allies, including the United States, were reducing the military spending and the number of soldiers under arms, Turkey was increasing because there were 3 wars at the time in 1991. At least one of them was important for the European Union, but 3 wars defining the early post-Cold War era. There were war in the Gulf. Kuwait was occupied by Iraq, and there were international operations. It started in 1991, and it continues until today, in fact, one way or another. There was another war in what we call in Turkey Balkans, or Southeastern Europe, what the European Union calls, the wars of former Yugoslavia, dissolution of former Yugoslavia. And there was a war in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which still continues. The conflict in the Balkans, well, on and off. So if you look at the map, Turkey was in the middle. And when you are sitting in Ankara and looking around yourself, what you saw is a world becoming even more dangerous than during the good old days of the Cold War. Because in the good old days of the Cold War, everything was quite predictable. There was one enemy, Soviet Union and its allies, and we know how to defend ourselves with the help of United States and in nuclear umbrella. But at the end of the Cold War, nobody was really interested in fighting with Russia anymore. And actually, the Europe and the West in general was trying to accommodate Russia, where Turkey faced with all this conflict. So it was early 1990s where Turkish foreign policy started to change and security policy also started to change. And then you saw Turkish interest in what people call Eurasia, or from Turkish perspective, it's the Turkic republics, where Turkey suddenly became very much interested and very much influential and pursuing policies of influence, and actually competing with Russia and Iran in Central Asia and the Caucasus, with the support of United States especially, but with some support from the European Union too. But these are before Erdogan came to power. This was a period of Turkey's changing, and it started before Erdogan. When Erdogan came to power, he found himself in a country which was trying to become a member of the European Union. And Erdogan, in his first term, was and has been the most pro-European Turkish politician ever that came to power in Turkey. I don't know whether he was sincere or not anyway, but he tried to move Turkey to the European Union. We talked during the lunch how and why he and Turkey failed to move there. Anyway, but the situation, his policies, therefore, in his first term, I would say, between 2002 and 2008, was pro-European, pro-Western, trying to be integrating into the West, into European Union. That story failed for many reasons, but let's not go into the reasons, but it failed. And after 2008, when Erdogan was re-elected in 2007, he actually changed his alignment system. When he came to power, he allied himself with liberals of the country in Turkey, both left-wing and right-wing liberals, big business, military, and the most segments of society was supporting his foreign policy of integrating with Europe. But when that project failed, and with the election, he has changed his alignment with what I would call liberal Islamists. Some people call them Muslim Calvinists as well, referring how they were looking to the world and interacting with the world. With this alignment, he changed his policies inside the Turkey, attacking the strong position of military in Turkish politics, consolidating his parties and his allies' positions in Turkish politics. And in international relations, the policy of the time was identified with the foreign minister of the time from 2010 onwards, but he was also, previously, he was an advisor to the Prime Minister Erdogan, Ahmet Davutoğlu. The policy called zero problem with neighbors. And it was a kind of a different type of an integration policy, in fact. It called for integration of Turkey's neighborhood with soft power of Turkey, using soft power of Turkey, creating an influence zone for Turkey and Turkish foreign policy in its neighborhood, mostly focused in the Black Sea, in the Balkans, and in the Middle East. Central Asia and Caucasus were out of the picture for Ahmet Davutoğlu, and eventually his policies failed for many reasons, but one of the important reasons was the Arab uprisings, and especially the Syrian civil war, 2011. The Syrian civil war became a test case for Turkey's soft power politics. It showed that in this neighborhood, the soft power doesn't really work. You need soft power up to a level, but also you need to carry big stick, to paraphrasing the Roosevelt. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. That was a policy after the Arab Spring in Turkey. And in fact, by this time, Erdogan in Turkey had faced another national elections, won another election, but this time he also started to change his allies in Turkey. The allies of what I call liberal Muslim Islamists became enemies, and they were pushed out of the alignment system, and they were replaced by Turkish nationalists, and what we call in Turkey Eurasianists. These are usually former left-wing nationalists, and also have inroads into the military. So Erdogan, after 2011, around that period, he started to ally himself with nationalists, Eurasianists, and military in Turkey. This brought different policies both inside and outside the country. Outside the country, it brought, instead of soft power, it brought focus on military, hard power. And Turkey started increasingly using its military force or threat to use military force in its foreign policy. So we have seen several interventions in Syria. A part of the territory is under Turkish control. Northern part of the northern Syria is under Turkish control at the moment. There are several operations, ongoing operations in northern Iraq. There are several Turkish forces unofficially and sometimes officially already stationed in that country also. Operations supporting the operations in Libya, and also Mira already mentioned in Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus. In almost all of these theater of operations, Turkey opposed, especially the influential position of the United States, but also in most of them, Turkey also opposed Russian presence in these regions. Sometimes it's very complicating policy. In Syria, for example, Turkey and Russia cooperates, but at the same time, Turkey and Russia disagrees and oppose each other. So there is there are so many balls always juggling as far as Turkey and Russia is concerned, cooperating against Western and mainly actually the United States policies and positions in the wider Middle East, but at the same time competing with each other to have an influence or to have their own policies. With these policies of what I would call militarization of Turkish foreign policy, Turkey gradually started to losing its friends and allies in its neighborhood, in fact. As much as Turkey started to pushing its positions in foreign policy, it brought Turkey to a conflict or disagreement with most of its neighbors in its region. So starting from the Gulf region, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece. Yeah, there were so many countries. Actually, if you look at the map, all the countries in Turkey's southern borders have become opposition to Turkey. And that Turkey successfully managed to this alliance of anti-Turkish grouping in its southern borders or southern regions. This, in a sense, is a kind of a failure, of course, very obvious failure of trying to create this influence zone. The result was vulnerability for Turkey and Turkish foreign policy. The result was isolation, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the result was increasingly distancing itself from the West and Turkey's traditional allies. Of course, this is not only related to this policy, it's also related to the calculations or analysis in the government circles. In the government circles, by this time after 2010-12, the analysis is that the world is changing. The world international system is changing. The power is moving towards the east. And the countries like Turkey, who has a regional role to play and who has a certain level of power to influence policies around itself, could play a wider and a more influential role in international politics via playing a more important role in its neighborhood. Here is the idea is not creating an empire or neo-empire. The idea is to creating a region, if I have to use the European language, European Union jargon, neighborhood. Turkey reckons, and the people who are ruling the country reckons that Turkey is a country which have an important, more influential role to play in its neighborhood, and it has to be reckoned with. This is not an idea of occupying, as you said, these regions, but there is an insistence that the countries who wants to be influential in this region or create policies for this region should consult with Turkey and should take into account Turkish position. And here, the main criticism goes to the United States because of its policies in the Middle East and especially touching the Kurdish issue, because that's the crux of the matter between United States and Turkey. the US policies in Iraq, in Syria, regarding the future of the Kurds of the region clashes with Turkish vision. And it touches to Turkey's nerve, because it is an issue from the perspective of Turkish state, Turkish military, and people who are ruling in the country, that this is the issue that might divide and break the country. So it's from Turkish perspective, the Kurdish issue, a survival issue. And when Turkey sees that the United States supports the Kurdish groups in northern Syria with military arms and etc. and training and etc., there is no alternative to go against that. Going against the United States in the Middle East means that Turkey had to cooperate with Russia in order to balance the United States and create an environment where it can play a bigger role. So then we come to this last period. This using of increasing military usage or threat of usage of military force, as I said, isolated Turkey and started to hurt Turkish ideals or Turkish vision for the region or for itself. And by end of 2020, middle of 2021, there came a new Turkish foreign policy, a new Erdogan, actually, in a sense. There was also another elections. And Erdogan this time started to moving to opposite direction. Now, Turkey is the best friend of everybody. In last 2 years, has been trying to implement renormalization, I would call renormalization of Turkey's relations with its neighbors in its neighborhood. So normalization of relations with United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, followed by normalization with Greece, now almost normalization with Egypt. What is left is Europe and United States. Here is, of course, we have to look into the wider picture, not only the regional policies, but wider global politics. As I said earlier, believing that the world international system is changing and power is moving to the east means also that Turkey could afford to wait, according to the academics and thinkers who are closer to the government. Turkey could wait and could push for what many people call autonomous foreign policy. Autonomous foreign policy is not only called by the European Union or by the French. Turkey was even there before the French. So this autonomous policy doesn't mean that Turkey would forgo its European connection or its alignment system with NATO. In fact, I know many people question Turkey's position and role within NATO, but in order to write an article, we started looking into the operations that NATO has had since the end of the Cold War, and this includes the recent ones. And Turkey almost participated almost all of them, all the NATO operations. And looking to what Turkey has been trying to do in the war between Russia and Ukraine, again, if you look at the real contribution of the Western countries to the defense of Ukraine, more than half of the European Union countries are contributing less than Turkey is doing. I'm not talking about the much talked Bayraktar UAVs in Ukraine. But Turkey is doing so many other things to Ukraine that is not in the press. This is the preference of the Turkish government, by the way. Turkish government does not wish to highlight what it's doing in Ukraine, because it might then upset its relations with Russia. The fact that Turkey is not joining the sanctions against Russia has many reasons, but it also allowed Turkey to become a more important player in this region. Because if you are looking after the war situation, it seems that Russia is bound to be weakened by this war, whatever happens. However the war is end, Russia is a weakened actor, which de facto means that Turkey is going to be the much powerful, much influential actor in the Caucasus, in the Black Sea, in Central Asia regions. And we are already seeing the reflections of this in various policies in these regions. So it makes sense from the Turkish perspective. At the same time, continue to have relationship with Russia, but at the same time help Ukraine. So it might look unprincipled policy, but that's the principle reigning in Turkey. Whatever Erdogan is, his current talk is about national interest of Turkey. And he's pushing emphasis, one after every day, almost every day, the nationalist rhetoric of national and local. Everything is about national and local. Production of cars, production of armaments, policies, economy, everything about populist, national, and local emphasis. And finally, let me finish with this Turkish position on imperialism and revisionism. It's very interesting because the founding fathers of Turkey in 1920s, this year is the 100th anniversary of establishment of Turkish Republic. So when they were establishing the Republic in 1923, one of the ideas that they push around or put forward in the global conception was that anti-imperialism. They imagined Turkey as an original anti-imperialist country because we became independent fighting with the arch-imperialist United Kingdom, France, and their tool Greece. Right? And they prided themselves to become a model for the third world countries. At the time, they were called third world countries, not the South. And this was a policy line kept repeated by several Turkish leaders up until 1970s. When Erdogan came to power, he challenged this old Turkish foreign policy in entirety. He changed the rhetoric. He didn't like traditional Turkish foreign policy, and etc. But now, in the last few years, maybe last 5 to 10 years, he started talking about anti-imperialist position of Turkey vis-a-vis Africa. Turkey has been made quite inroads into the Africa in the last 10, 15 years, which is mostly economic and political connections. But wherever Erdogan goes in Africa, whenever he talks about Africa, he almost mentions that Turkey's position in Africa is anti-imperialist position, and he contrasts Turkish position with the position of especially France nowadays. But without naming the countries, he says we are different from those imperialist countries, which everybody understands, generally Western countries. So he's now priding himself, putting Turkey as an anti-imperialist country. And whenever Turkey has problems with France, for example, in Libya or in sub-Saharan Africa, his explanation is very clear. It's happening because we are anti-imperialists and they are the imperialists. So let me stop here.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Question for Ivan, last but not least, and I think that prove how history and international relations are changing is that in 19th century there was an Eastern question, what was a question that the Western powers, European powers, has a common agreement that the destiny and future of Ottoman Empire and the Balkans are a question of and for the great powers then in 19th century. So I think that this anecdote from the Congress of Berlin in 1878, that is from Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, if we can use this concept for 19th century, he said, if you are not on the table, you are in menu. And now we are on this table, we are talking about Russia, which will become weaker, and Turkey will be stronger. We just, more or less 200 years has passed. But my question for Ivan is, the Balkans was part first of the different empires, of the Ottoman Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and after the disintegration and destruction of former Yugoslavia and the fall of the Berlin Wall, more or less all of us agreed that first time in history, the Balkans countries have opportunity to choose their own destiny. Without empires, out of communism, out of any kind of empire. No? But also now, when we see that there is no end of history, and that maybe we are just in the new international world order, also we are witness that even the Balkan countries can choose their own destiny. Also, the Balkans are again a theater, a scenario of the great power competition. Even the powers are changed. I mean, we are not talking about Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian Empire, but we are talking about the European Union, Russia, China, Turkey, above all in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my question is, first, is it true that we can choose our destiny first time in our history? Some countries maybe proved it already, like Slovenia and Croatia. Macedonia and Montenegro are members of the Atlantic Alliance. But is it true? And second question is there any danger in this new situation where I said we because I was born in former Yugoslavia, that we are playground for great power competition. So, like, sometimes I feel that we cannot escape of this empire and just be like normal countries. There is always something, no? What is your perception and thoughts about it?
All of the above. Well, first of all, thank you, Mira, for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be with Sergey and Mustafa on the same panel, both of whom I respect very deeply for their insights, and we've known each other for a while. I do believe that this is the first time that we can choose for ourselves in this region. We have been, the playground of powers throughout the millennia, and because we went to the same elementary schools, you learn that we are at the crossroads of civilization, that the Roman Empire split down the middle, that the Catholic, the Christian Church split down the middle of our country, Yugoslavia, and then you go to other countries and you hear the same story. We are in Hungary they say the same thing, and in other countries. So basically, this area has been subject to empires. And with the sea change of 1989, I think there's a new era opens. It's definitely not the end of history, because unfortunately in our country, Yugoslavia, we went the other way, and we thought that we were the exception to the rule where everybody was going towards democracy and consolidation of Europe. We decided that we were going to be the proverbial car driving in the wrong direction on the same lane of the highway. And of course, we had a crash, a very dramatic crash. And it is a war in former Yugoslavia. It is geographically in the Balkans, but it's not a Balkan war. It's a Yugoslav war, and I think it's important to say that. The other countries were brought in because they, negatively benefited from the sanctions, because the country was under sanctions, and when you're under sanctions, there's smuggling, there's corruption, and lots of people make a lot of money, both in the countries and then in the neighboring countries, because gas, oil, cigarettes, you name it, are being smuggled. But the second sea change, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, was, in my mind, an equal tipping point, Zeitenwende, to use the German word, where nothing is the same as before. And I think it is, in a sense, it says two things. One is that the kind of linear progress towards democracy is not a realistic proposition, both because what we thought was the Yugoslav exception, return to nationalism and populism, starts spreading throughout Europe with populist movements, right-wing, spreads in America with Trump, and we sort of have a backlash to the development. And then secondly, it is because the whole, what we call the Helsinki architecture of 1975 collapses. The Helsinki Accords put together a framework of how we avoid conflict in the Cold War, respecting each other's sovereignty, and you remember what Helsinki was about, where, of course, the Soviet Union played a key part. In fact, the idea was instigated by the Soviet Union. Of course, Sergei could tell us a lot about that history, which is very important. So we see a collapse. We see a unification of the West against what Russia did. Of course, there's the shock that war on a big scale comes back to Europe. The Yugoslav wars were terrible in every regard, but they were circumscribed to this territory. They didn't spill over the territory. This is a whole different order of magnitude of a nuclear power attacking a European sovereign state called Ukraine. Of course, the thing began in 2014, but somehow Europeans didn't take it seriously. Two things wake up Europe. One is that Europe is still fully dependent on the American security umbrella. Europe cannot cope with this alone. With whatever resources it's putting in militarily and economically, helping Ukraine, supporting it, this does not happen without the United States. Europe's famous sovereignty idea, strategic sovereignty, will not happen at least in the next 25 years. It will be until the Europe comes back to full military capability. The US will be there for it. Now the question is, let's not go there. What if Trump wins in 24? What if some other Republican wins and they decide to not support Ukraine in its military fight with Ukraine? That's a whole different thing. So one is full reliance on the US military. Europe, we simply cannot do it alone. Second thing is, of course, the Handel zum Wandel, or rather the Wandel zum Handel, the German expression. Through trade, we will be able to smooth relations, and we will sort of reach a state where we can, trade with each other, and we won't do wars with each other. It's not the Germans who invented this. This goes back to the famous French thinker and philosopher Montesquieu, who talked about les douze effets du commerce, the sweet effects of commerce. Well, throw that to the dustbin, because the fact that Russia was exporting gas in such enormous quantities, that Europe was exporting technologies and sort of helping Russian industry move, and that somehow would create a world where at least we wouldn't have war. Well, that did not happen. What is surprising, in fact, is that Germany, after the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea and the Donbass, it's only after 2014 they decide to build the second gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2. So Nord Stream 1 existed, Russia invades, takes Ukraine, and Germany under Merkel merrily decides to go ahead with building a second pipeline. In hindsight, of course, we're all very intelligent and smart, and we realize that this was a mistake, but sort of Germany is blindsided by this commercial relationship. Of course, it is driven by German industry, who is simply addicted to cheap energy, to cheap Russian gas. And they, you know, when you're an addict, you can't stop. And so suddenly this is the second, so the military dependence on the US, and second is gas dependency. Now we know that all countries have put sanctions on Russia, unfortunately, and I am ashamed to say my country, Serbia, has not put sanctions on Russia, but everybody has deals with Russia. Austria, I mean, the EU representative ambassador to Austria, I chaired a panel last week, Martin Selmayr, who was the maker and breaker under the Juncker Commission. He was the Secretary General of the Commission. He said in public, well, it's blood money that Austria is paying to Russia because they're importing more gas from Russia than ever. Now you can imagine the whole public opinion exploded. It was on the television news, the first item, and ministers attacked him, but the Green ministers in the coalition government of Austria supported him. So much for coalition politics. But he said something very true. Hungary, who put sanctions, has an exemption. Slovakia has exemptions. The Czech Republic has an oil exemption. Bulgaria, etc. All this to say that, you know, the world is complicated. I don't want to go further than that. My friend and our friend Ivan Krastev has a program at the Institute which he has renamed. It was a program on working on Russian things. He changed it last autumn, quoting the famous late American anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who already in the 90s talked about the world in pieces. And I think it very simply captures the fact that the world is in pieces. And that, you know, are we going to put Humpty Dumpty together again? Not sure about that, because events, you will all know that expression by the British Prime Minister, events change things. And the world evolves even beyond these things, and I mentioned, and I won't talk for much longer, Mira, Africa. Look at Africa, you know, the things that are happening in this, not only in the Middle Belt with the coup d'etat in African countries, but equally significantly the anti-French sentiment. Of course, the entry of Russia with Wagner troops, and the fact that there is a continuing anti-colonial sentiment. I mean, France had troops in Niger, they're exploiting the uranium, exploiting other things, and this is not what gets much news, because the Africans are feeling exploited again through other means. And so we're seeing a change there. I do a flashback quickly, because the BRICS have come out, and I think, you know, in a changing world that we're talking about, it's important to mention. Some people have said, well, maybe this is the new non-aligned movement. No, it's not the new non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was something that Yugoslavia, India, and Egypt came together in 1960, 61, the first conference in Belgrade, Tito, Nehru, and Nasser. It was kind of between the two blocks, a wedge, saying, you know, listen to us. It was a different period. It was the decolonization period. The Ghanas and various African countries and Asian countries understood that they had a voice, and it was a propitious moment to have that. The BRICS is completely different. BRICS is basically under Chinese tutelage because they are the strongest. China, in the famous Xi Jinping speech at the Party Congress, whatever it is now, 7 years ago, basically said, and I'm somewhat overstating it, China will rule the world by 2030, I can't remember the date that he said. The Chinese are patient, they have a 5,000-year civilization, you know, they can take their time in doing this. The Belt and Road Initiative, you know, buying the ports in Europe, Piraeus, the port in Portugal, part of the port in Hamburg, Germany, etc. They're putting their piece of the puzzle together. They own the big copper mine in Serbia, for example, but a lot of investments in technology companies in the West. So it's not only the Balkans that are a place where China is asserting its influence. As you know, Orban accepted a Chinese university in Budapest, etc. So to close on this issue, I definitely think that every country that has joined the European Union and NATO chose by itself. This was not imposed. The rhetoric from Russia or a Lavrov is, you are all vassal states. And the nationalists in our country say, we are vassal states. No, we're not vassal states. You have to acknowledge the reality. We are small states that are dependent on European foreign direct investments and American foreign direct investments. We would not have an economy if we did not have Western foreign direct investments. So it is an illusion to talk about some independent policy that you could have at a socio-economic. That's what I say when I speak in my country relatively often, and that goes also for what happened with the NATO bombing of our country, and that's why sentiment about joining NATO is a tricky thing. So when Lavrov says to Montenegro before joining NATO, or North Macedonia before joining NATO, you are doing this because the Americans and Europeans are forcing you to become members, that's simply not true. That's simply not true. These countries see their security and their livelihood in the Western sphere. You just have to look at the map every morning. That's really enough. Just look at the geography and see how far Russia is from these countries and how far China is. Yes, we accept Chinese investments into infrastructure. I would much rather like that the European Union exercises geoeconomics as geopolitics and make infrastructure investments even though they not be economically profitable in the immediate. They are profitable in the geopolitical sense. You cannot allow an empty space for Russia to come in, for China to come in, to fill that space because they are looking further ahead. Russia is in the Balkans simply for spoiler reasons. They want to show the weakness of the European Union, the democratic weakness, the failure of NATO to secure these countries. They know, they're not stupid people. They look at the map and they know this belongs into the Western sphere of influence, to use old language. And because they were communist and they want to emancipate themselves in a complicated situation, that ultimately this will be part of Europe. But if Europe, and that is why enlargement is so important, is not doing the work, we are back in that story, and I hope that thanks to the fact that Ukraine and Moldova are now candidate countries, that the Western Balkans becomes part of that story. But this is a geopolitical imperative if Europe is to remain a credible actor on the world stage between the US and China. Russia has the GDP equivalent of Italy. It is not a big economic player. It has a nuclear bomb, that's true. But this is why Europe, I think, and through this pronouncement, we will hear the State of the Union speech by von der Leyen in 2 days at Thursday. I think she will repeat the enlargement imperative of the EU. Nothing easy about that. Ukraine will not join tomorrow, nor will our countries join. But that is why, and this is why I end, I think we need a success story, and it's, I think, possible to regain credibility by bringing in 2 small countries, or maybe just 1, and I put forward the candidacy of Montenegro, which is a country of barely just over 500,000 people. It wouldn't cost the European Union anything, but symbolically it would be very important. After the last enlargement 10 years ago, when Croatia joined, to say in 2028, say, you see we're bringing in another country. It's irrelevant that it's a small country, but it shows the willingness, the geopolitical and geostrategic direction of the European Union to show enlargement continues. Here we are, bring in Moldova, could be a second. But importantly, it sends a message to a country like mine, Serbia, okay, why? If Montenegro can join, why can't we? There will be pressure from public opinion to join.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes more until we will be out of time. I have 2 questions more. I prepare it, but maybe it's much more interesting to hear from you. If you have a question, and then maybe if we have time, I can put another one, but Valentin Puig, very wise man, writer, journalist, and so on.
Not every day.
Not every day, but I suspect that today you are a wise man. Better with micro? Yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations for such a splendid trio of speakers in talking about subjects so deeply complicated. And may I ask a question to the 3 speakers? Focusing on the Ukrainian war, some talking from the point of view of liberal order say it's a war of autocracies against democracies. And in terms of realpolitik, some say it's a territorial aggression. Don't look furthermore. What do you think about it? And if in any case, well, it could go both ways, but in any case, in which way will this affect the world order? Thank you.
Thank you. Territorial aggression. Your second hypothesis was territorial aggression of democracy versus autocracies. Maybe let's start with Mustafa, just to change the world order of this table.
For me, it's very clear, actually. It's a good old concept of geopolitics. I'm a realist by tradition in international relations. I work on geopolitics and strategy, and I have not seen what the liberals saw with the end of the Cold War. I simply saw a change of scenery with the end of the Cold War. And since 2008, we have seen what many people call return of geopolitics. Russia, this is not the first time that Russia has become expansionist and aggressive. I think Georgia was the first warning shot. In the West, we didn't understood that first warning. Crimea was the second warning, and we still refuse to understand that. Personally, I did understood, and many people in Turkey did, and many people in Europe also did, but the powers that to be refused to accept the reality. That's the old understanding of geopolitics. So I don't buy into that argument of authoritarian leaders versus the democracies. Even during the Cold War, when the competition and ideological discussions were shaped between the fight between democracies and dictatorial countries or the communist countries, that was again very old style of geopolitical competition. what happened was at the end of the Second World War was a system that established by the winners, and the winners and losers were very clear by the end of the Second World War, so everybody accepted the system. What happened at the end of the Cold War is, although the winners seems to be quite clear, the losers are not very clear, and they have not accepted that they are the losers. So they are not complying with the system that is supposed to be running, and a system that is actually outdated. Because the current international system that especially the United States is trying to uphold is based on the structure and the balance of power that existed in 1945. Today it has changed, and we have to change it accordingly. And these are the current wars, and the conflicts and disputes are just the reflections of that change. That's the first thing, I think. And I also do not buy the idea that it was in Mira's instruction to us, or at least the notes to us, that the imperialism is something outdated.
Yeah.
The imperialism is never outdated. It's simply not called as such. There is an excellent book that I like to draw your attention. It's by an American political scientist, historian. It's Daniel Immerwahr. He wrote a book in 2019. It's called How to Hide an Empire. How to Hide an Empire. And its subtitle is A History of the Greater United States. This was a time in 2019 was a time everybody was talking about greater this and greater that, and he wrote a book about greater United States, How to Hide an Empire. And this is not how to hide an US empire from outsiders. Actually, he wrote to the American audience to tell them how the American government have been hiding its empire from its own citizens. It's a fascinating book. So even though we don't call the countries empires anymore, the policies that they are following are more or less same. Not military empires, but it's economic empires. It's soft power is being used instead of hard power. So even Ivan just said that the Balkan countries are small countries, and they cannot pretend to be an independent countries when they need huge European investment. Well, this is what neo-imperialism is. I mean, Central and Eastern Europe is being controlled by German industry, right? So we might be very careful about how we pitch these disputes between democracy and authoritarianism. Sure, there is a tendency today in the world that the politics is moving towards more authoritarianism. That's for sure. If you look at the studies by Freedom House and other independent international institutions, globally, democracy is weakening. And it's not only weakening in countries like clearly authoritarian, but it's weakening in the countries which used to be free democracies. United States is not a free democracy anymore by this standard. Many of the European Union countries are not free democracies by this standard. Everywhere globally, democracy is weakening in the last 5 years. With the populism and everything, I would call democracy is under attack. Centralization and authoritization is going on across the world. And it cuts across different traditions, different countries, like China, India, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, even United Kingdom and the United States. So these are countries totally different from each other, and they have all this, many people call populist moment to be nice, but it's more towards less democracy and towards more authoritarian. So it's I think, old style. We have to distinguish between this domestic a way of governing countries, and there is a discussion there between autocracy and democracy, but from the foreign policy. Foreign policies are similar almost in all these countries as well. Everybody wants to have more influence.
I asked Ivan to talk 5 minutes and then
sorry,
last. No. You talk 5 minutes. Just everyone has 5 minutes.
No,
and just to, because it's a little bit late and I know that all, okay, maybe we can try another question. But yes, please, this is a very interesting question and I prepare more or less one question similar. So I'm very happy that you ask.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, Mustafa said a lot already, but I will go back to 1989. I mean, the Soviet Union lost a competition that it itself defined. You know, we will beat and overtake the United States and the Western world. Gorbachev came and said, you know, let's shut down the shop, we can't do this anymore, and basically told the Soviets the reality that was there. That's why he's not liked, because he acknowledged the reality, and that's a lot what this is all about, acknowledging the realities that we live in. You know, President Vučić is trying to be Erdogan and leading a balanced foreign policy. There's a small difference. Turkey is about 80 million and we are 6 million. So, yeah. So, yeah, you know, you have to acknowledge the reality and try and go along with what it is. I agree, this was not about democracy and autocracy, although we need to keep reminding ourselves, you know, everybody wants to come to Europe and go to the US. They're not going to China or Russia to seek a better life. So with all the imperfections that Mustafa rightly talked about, this is still the less bad world to live in Europe and in the US. There's no denying that. And as a political scientist and somebody who studied political philosophy, democracy is always a struggle. You have to win it and defend it in the street. Rulers will always try to take away rights and freedoms, and evil of history can always come back. Unfortunately, we in our former country, Yugoslavia, that no longer exists, had to live it on our skins. Even though at school we learned never again, we were taken to the camps, saw the movies, read the books, and yet our leaders went into war on an ethnic basis and huge violence. So I think as citizens of this world and of Europe, we need to fight this. There's no sitting back and saying, and we're doing analysis here, but that Russia is a totalitarian state. You know, it's very simple. Everyone is in prison or dead. All NGOs are closed. They closed down Memorial. Navalny is in prison. I wouldn't like to live there, and I don't think anyone wants to. Now we can discuss Russian state policy and all that, and you know whether they feel diminished or not. But this is not a model of society, and that is, I think, when we talk about this, this is a pure neo-imperialist. You know, Ukraine is in fact part of us. They are not different. In fact, they pretend they're different, and we need to control our sphere of influence. If we allow them, yes, this will be the case. If we don't, then there is a danger of further expansion into this territory. And the final word, my colleague and friend Tim Snyder, the professor of Yale University and a fellow at my institute in Vienna, gave a big speech about 3 years ago and talked about the European Union as in fact a project which is about dealing with the end of empire. How Britain and France and Italy, imperial states, dealt with it. I had a big discussion with Tim and he agreed with me. I said, Tim, you are right, but you cannot deny that this is about also avoiding war in Europe for the nth time. European intellectuals and leaders sat down and said, why do we need to kill each other every 30, 40 years? After World War I, in World War II, the Spinellis and Schumanns of this world really had this earnest. He has a point that And Hans Kunani, who has just written this book, Whiteness, which I recommend because it tests our Europeanness, said that in 1957, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, France had all its imperial territories in the Treaty of Rome, right? So did Britain, which was not in 57. So this is a kind of, we're hiding this from ourselves, that France led an imperial war in Algeria until 1961, right? So, and not to talk about Portugal and Spain that joined late, but anyway.
No, I'm very tempted to say something, but just one sentence of British historian Geoffrey Hoskins, who said, unlike France and Great Britain, which had an empire, Russia was an empire. Indeed. And this is one of the problems, even from France, was very difficult to say, okay, I have to leave it go, just, I have to let them to go follow their own destiny. In case of Russia, it's more difficult because the borders of Russia were never clear, and so on and so on. So, Sergei, I just couldn't resist, yeah.
Yeah, you know, that was a very popular idea that the core of the Ukraine war and in broader terms Ukraine crisis is that Russia was afraid of Ukraine becoming democracy, becoming a success story, and then Russians sort of following the example. I never really bought this story. I think it's far too simple, and you know, it's not like you don't have democracies next to Russia. The idea that Russians would follow Ukrainians is kind of mirroring Putin's approach, that these are just the same people, and this is why if one goes in a certain direction, the other will go too. I don't buy it. But the thing is that the war makes this story of autocracy versus democracy a self-fulfilling prophecy on both sides. On the side of Ukraine, you have enormous enthusiasm for building up relations with the West and integrating into Western institutions, EU, NATO, at the levels that had been unseen before the war in Ukraine. So you always had significant skepticism towards NATO, at least in Ukraine, and now everybody is sort of on a very serious note supportive of any forms of cooperation, understandably. On the Russian side, you have the Russian government well aware of all the criticism that comes their way from the West, and they reject it. And what you get as a result is sort of basically the attitude, yes, we are an autocracy and we like it. Of course, it's not pronounced like 100% like this. Officially, Russia says that it is a democracy, but not a Western style. But you know, a number of Russian officials, they refer to the West calling Russia Mordor, sort of the Lord of the Rings description of the evil empire, and they're referring to it playfully. They're not saying like, you refer to us as Mordor and we are not. They're like, you refer to us as Mordor, you mean that we are very central, very powerful, you're afraid of us? Okay, we can live with that. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy, but on the other hand, among government critical voices in Russia, you know, one of the most popular books that was written and published recently was by Alexander Baunov of Carnegie, and the book is called The End of the Regime, and this is not the Russian regime, but it's the Franco dictatorship, It's the Greek dictatorship of the past, the Portuguese, some other stories brought together to show how the regimes that were definitely autocratic and that seemed to be, like in some cases, eternal, that existed for decades and people barely believed they can end, how they ended. So the attitude to this dichotomy of democracy versus autocracy on the side of government critical voices is that it's not the end of the road for Russia as a country. So we'll see. And one more thing, speaking of territory and people, of course, this is the way Putin sees it, that this is a geopolitical fight against Western influence. I don't think he just says it publicly but doesn't believe it. I think he does believe it. And in this sense, an interesting idea was thrown into discussion by late former spin doctor of the Kremlin, Gleb Pavlovsky, who said yet before the invasion started that there's a growing risk of war, and he explained it in an interesting way. He said Putin got bored with the Russian Federation as he inherited it from Yeltsin. He got bored with a country that is sort of limited in ambition and even geographical scope, and he believed that Russia can do more, and the West will not be able to oppose this push if he makes it. And we are currently living through the consequences of this attitude.
Okay, we are out of time, but very, very quick question for one person, I hope. Please choose, because no, we are out of time. It's too long. But
I understand perfectly, Mira. Thanks a lot. I would like to ask Mustafa Aydin if there is any option in a change of direction in Turkish politics, and a change in Turkish politics if Erdogan loses the power. I know it's quite difficult because the opposition is weak, and Erdogan has made a big effort in, taking out critics, journalists, officials, university professors after the coup d'etat. But is there any option of a change in direction in Turkey, or Erdogan will continue ruling for, I don't know, decades?
Please be short and brilliant.
Just won the election for 5 years. So if we are talking after 5 years, that's it. But yeah, there is a changing, there is a already changing direction. That depends not only Turkey. I always argued that it depends more on the European countries than Turkey. Turkey could ally itself with Europe or be against Europe, but it depends on European willingness to pull back Turkey to Europe. I don't see much of a change in the European mainstream political position, as much as current Erdogan government and in general wider Turkey wants to align or realign itself with European Union. I don't see much reciprocity from the European Union. Many countries, domestic politics in many countries, at least 3 more important countries, let's say, in the European Union, are against Turkish membership. Without that, it's very difficult for Turkey to align with the European Union on many policies, because most of that realignment necessitates giving up concessions, changing Turkish priorities in foreign policy, etc. And in Turkish mind, without getting anything in return, the idea of concession or giving up doesn't mean anything.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you for coming to Madrid. Even Madrid is a wonderful city. I hope that you are enjoyed here. Thank you very much for your attention. See you tomorrow if you have time. We will start at 10 a.m. and we will talk about the European Union and how Europe could contribute to conserve the liberal international world order. So, thank you again, and bye. I'm more talking.